In this session, we're going to be looking at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's the official name of the group. Sometimes this group is referred to as the Mormons, and we'll highlight here a little bit later why, where that name comes from. The most recent numbers that I've seen for the number of Mormons is a little bit over 16 million. It took 117 years to get to 1 million members. So that was from, excuse me, 1830 to 1947. 1947 was when they reached their first million. But since then, it's only taken 70 years to get to 16 million. So it's grown rapidly. At various times in the past couple of years, it's been identified as the second fastest growing religion after Islam. But there have been some times where it hasn't been as growing as fast as some groups. Not quite, well, almost 60% of Mormons are spread throughout the world. So most of Mormonism is reflected in other countries rather than the United States. So it's right around 40%, a little bit over 40% in the United States, the rest throughout the world, predominantly in the global South. But it is a sizable group, a group that continues to grow. There's a lot of growth in the global South. Largely, a lot of that is due to the very, very extensive mission work that is done by the Latter-day Saints. There's a requirement for young adults after high school to take 2 years to do mission work. So that, of course, puts a lot of people in the field every year. Despite it being a global religion these days, it's important to understand that the church developed in the United States. And the United States situation, the situation in the United States was very important for its development, where it came from, as well as some of the things that are very important about it, even to this day, although there is much more recognition of the global spread and attention to that. There's still a lot of influence from the American culture. But it's important to see that there are some key things that were going on in the United States in the late 1820s, throughout the 1820s, and that had a profound effect on how Mormonism developed. One of those things was the presence of revivalism. The early 19th century was really marked by a lot of interest in religion, particularly emotional expressions of religion. And so throughout the early 19th century, there was a lot of people interested in Christianity. There was a lot of people who were making commitments to different churches. And it was also a time period where people were becoming recommitted to their religious background if they hadn't been before. It was also a time of a lot of individualism. Right, remember, we're kind of still in the early republic period of the United States in its history. And so there was a lot of emphasis on the importance of the individual. And really where that comes to play with the American religious scene is that for a lot of people, the emphasis was on the ability of an individual to determine truth for oneself. That a minister, a pastor, a priest wasn't needed. And that came out of the individualism, but it also came out of a sharp difference between the elites in culture and the common people. And so many of the new religious leaders that developed were often criticized traditional religious leaders as being somebody disconnected from the common person, and often emphasized the the ability of the common person to determine truth on their own. I mean, that you can understand religion, you can experience religion without the need for a pastor or a priest. It was also a time of a lot of new religious movements. I'm sorry that part got cut off from the screen, but there were a lot of religious movements that developed in the early 19th century. It was a time of religious innovation. With the First Amendment, people had the opportunity to create religious movements. They didn't need to rely on, the established churches. And so in some places, new religious movements popped up quite often. And we, of course, talked about new religious movements in the previous section, but especially in the 19th century, there was a lot of these movements popping up. One such region was upstate New York, which began to be referred to as the burned over district because of the amount of people or the amount of new religious movements that developed and the amount of religious fervor that developed during the 19th century, especially that early part. The founder of Mormonism was a man named Joseph Smith Jr. He was born on December 23rd, 1805, to Joseph and Lucy Smith. He was born in Vermont to a family that was, well, they were religious, but they weren't ever really associated with any one particular Christian movement or denomination for a very long period. They kind of floated around to different groups. And so for a lot of his early life, there wasn't a very stable, consistent commitment to a specific religious movement. And, the family also practiced a lot of folk magic, astrology, which was common with a lot of people at the time. So it wasn't necessarily something unusual, but it was something that was a part of their religious experience. The family moved to upstate New York in 1815. In 1820, at the age of 15, again, a lot of this is according to the church's tradition, Joseph was perplexed by the religious scene that was taking place. Remember, he's in that place of upstate New York, so there's a lot of religious fervor, a lot of new religious movements, and so he wants to know which of these churches are true, which of these are ones that should be followed. And so he decides what he's going to do is to go out into a little grove near his house, and he's going to pray until he's able to determine what religious movement, what religious church was the one to become a part of. While he was praying, two persons appeared to him, kind of as pillars of light. And they identified themselves as the Father and the Son, and that's what's demonstrated in the picture here. The Father and the Son told Smith that he wasn't supposed to join any church. All the churches that existed in 1820 were wrong. Their creeds were abominations. Their leaders were corrupt, and that they were going to restore the Church of Jesus Christ through him. This event, this experience, is known as the first vision, right? Capital F, capital V, signifying that he would experience other visions, other revelations, but this was the one that was very, very important in kind of setting young Joseph off for a life of religious leadership. 3 years after that, in 1823, Smith was visited by an angel who identified himself as Moroni. Moroni told Joseph about a book on gold plates that was buried in a nearby hill, and it was going to be, these plates and the translation of these plates that would bring about this restoration that the Father and the Son had promised. Evidently, he was shown the plates. Again, a lot of this, all of this is according to church's tradition. He was shown the plates, but he was not allowed to retrieve them at that time. He had to wait until he was told to, and so it would be another 4 years before he was allowed to retrieve the plates. The plates were with two stones called the Urim and the Thummim, and it was supposedly the use of these stones that would allow Smith to translate the plates. Now, the Urim and the Thummim are mentioned in the Bible, in the Old Testament. They were not used for this purpose in the Old Testament. They were used to determine God's will, but in this case, the idea is that Smith is going to use these stones to translate this book. And according to the tradition, right, he kind of sets up a place in his house. He's not really allowed to use too many people. They're not allowed to see the plates either. And so there's kind of like, there's tales of him, taking a long sheet and dividing a room in his house, and he would stand on one side with the plates and the stones, and there'd be somebody on the other side to write down what he was translating. And so he'd use the stones, and a line would appear with the translation. He would read the translation across the sheet. The person on the other side would copy it down and then read it back to him. And once that was, once it was sure that they had exactly what was in the translation, they would move on. And when translated, this book was known as the Book of Mormon and was first published in 1830. So let's talk a little bit, about the story of the Book of Mormon. What's the narrative that takes place there? In the Book of Mormon, the narrative starts around the time of the destruction of the first, temple, Solomon's temple, in 587. And according to the narrative, God appears to a man living in Jerusalem by the name of Lehi, and he is told that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And he is to leave with his family that included two sons named Laman and Nephi, and that they are to sail away from Jerusalem. And so they supposedly get on a boat, sail away, eventually arriving in what would become North America. The descendants of the two sons, Laman and Nephi, eventually grow so large that they become tribes named after the two sons, Lamanites and Nephites. And they have kind of a mixed history. Sometimes they were good, sometimes they were bad, sometimes one was good and the other was bad, sometimes it flipped where the opposite was true. But these tribes are growing. There's some other details. Obviously a lot of this is very simplified, but it gives you the main points. Around the year 30 to 33 AD, Jesus, before he ascends back to heaven, appears to the two tribes in North America. And the claim is that he presented the same message to the peoples of North America that he had been providing to the Jews in Israel and Palestine. And so the two tribes accept the message of Jesus. Jesus ascends to heaven. Eventually, though, most of the Nephites will become bad, after a couple generations, and so they will make war against the Nephites and wipe them out. The last two Nephites, the last two survivors, are a man named Mormon and his son Moroni. Mormon writes down the events of this, what we've been talking about, on gold plates, and then buried the plates, had Moroni bury the plates in a hill in what would become upstate New York. All right. And so there's the connection between Mormon and the Book of Mormon, and Moroni being an angelic representative, the angelic form of the human Moroni, the son of Mormon. The Lamanites would eventually develop into what we call today Native Americans, which meant that essentially this idea that Native Americans are lost tribes of Israel. Now today, those of us who aren't Mormons, might think this is a very strange idea. And of course, there's a lot of anthropological discovering and evidence that calls a lot of this into question with the ethnic origins of Native Americans, etc. But I want us to see, though, that the idea that Native Americans were lost tribes of Israel is not unique to the Mormons. Now, how they became lost tribes of Israel is unique, right? This narrative is unique to Mormonism. But there were a lot of Christians in the early centuries, the European Christians, and those descended from European Christians, who believed that Native Americans were lost tribes of Israel. I mean, if you think of, here's a group where their entire worldview is shaped by the Bible, and they only know about the peoples discussed in the Bible. And so as they're coming over here, they're encountering Native Americans, and they don't know what to do about understanding Native Americans because Native Americans aren't discussed in the Bible. Instead of saying, okay, maybe this is maybe this is information that God didn't see fit to include in the Bible, the assumption becomes, okay, we must understand these people that we're encountering through something found in Scripture. And so one way that a lot of people turned to was believing that these people were lost tribes of Israel. There were tribes of Israel that were lost, and so they must have made their way over here. So the notion, the concept of Native Americans being lost tribes of Israel is not unique to Mormonism, even though this part is. So it wouldn't have been that unusual to make a claim that Native Americans were lost tribes of Israel. There were other biblical ideas that people used to talk about Native Americans, but this is where Mormonism kind of adds its distinctive approach to this. There are other stories in the Book of Mormon, in other documents, that also include some important information, important teachings. One of those is claims that God and Jesus are physical beings. There's certainly an emphasis on the spiritual life in Mormonism, but there is something very, very important about the physical life, and the idea that God and Jesus are not just spiritual beings, but physical beings as well. Other parts of the Book of Mormon talk about the Garden of Eden existing on the American continent, that it wasn't in what's now modern-day Iraq, but was on North America, perhaps Missouri. And so, the idea was that the New Jerusalem would be established, in where what the Garden of Eden was, and that the end times, the saints, the people that were a part of this group, would gather where Zion was going to develop. Still, other parts of the Book of Mormon are framed as a prophecy, that there would be a man named Joseph who would restore, a true church, the true church in the American continent. And so Moroni is, kind of foretells this apostasy, and how in a time of sin and corruption, God is going to disclose the book to a man named Joseph. So what we have here, of course, is a new revelation. Why would it have been accepted? I mean, obviously, we can see why a lot of people would reject it, and there were a lot of people that rejected it, but there were a lot of people, or there were people that accepted it. Why? Well, when you think about it, in the 19th century, the United States was very unstable, especially when it came to religion. There was a lot of religious chaos. And so that lent itself to disturbances in the social order as well. And there were other movements that emphasized a revitalization of Christianity. And so, this kind of taps into a general feeling in the United States of needing stability, of looking for answers, looking for truth, wanting to get back to what was originally intended. And so, this idea of providing some answers for a lot of questions people are asking. Additionally, you're looking for protection from God, right? Looking for, interested in hearing a message of God's prophet, right? A lot of the Book of Mormon, very, very similar. Some people have claimed that a lot of it is plagiarized from the King James Version, but there's a lot of similarity there to the King James Version, and so people would have been, kind of already tapped into some things that they might have been more open to this message, though of course a lot of people rejected it, believing that revelation had ceased with the finality of the New Testament, etc. But there were still some that were open to the idea of new truths. As the church community grew, they encountered persecution, not surprisingly. Particularly a lot of the persecution, a lot of the resistance came from traditional Christians. And it was at that time, after suffering a lot of persecution there in upstate New York, that Smith is said to have received a revelation from God that the community should move to the west. They moved at first to Missouri. They experienced some persecution, and so they moved to Kirtland, Ohio. In Ohio, they built the first temple. That's the picture, of course, a more modern picture in the background on the right-hand side, representative of that Kirtland temple. They accrued some debt, established a bank, they printed money, which was a lot easier to do in the early 19th century. In fact, if you've ever heard the saying, as phony as a $3 bill, one of the types of currency that was created by the Mormons was a $3 bill. So that kind of connects there. But, they faced persecution in Kirtland eventually as well. Smith was tarred and feathered. Yes, they actually did that. It was also during this time that the practice of polygamy or plural marriage developed. And so there were rumors that got out in the community that this was taking place, and so there was persecution because of that. And so the saints, as they were known, outsiders, of course, referred to them as Mormons, but they preferred the term saints. They moved again back to Missouri. For a while, they experienced some opportunity to live peaceably in Missouri, in Jackson County, Missouri. But eventually, the Mormons, the Missourians, pressured the Mormons to leave. This erupted into what became known as the Mormon War. There were some Mormons that were prevented from voting in Missouri because Smith had been very anti-slavery, and Missouri was a slave state. And so this condemnation of slavery led to some persecution. There was a massacre of several Mormons. The Haun's Mill Massacre, as it was known, where 250 Missourians entered Caldwell County, where the Mormons were living, and started shooting. Some of the men and some of the boys ran into a blacksmith shop. Rifles were stuck in, and they just opened fire, right? And the Mormons had nowhere to go. Around the same time, the governor of Missouri signed Executive Order 44, which became known as the Extermination Order. It ordered all Mormons out of Missouri, quote, by any means. Mormons, though, were not only on the persecution side. There were some times where they were the persecutors as well. There were Mormon militias created at various places in Missouri. When the Mormons left Missouri, they went to a city in Illinois known as Commerce. They renamed it Nauvoo. And in Nauvoo, Smith was elected mayor. The Mormons had some control. They built a new temple, created some new practices, but ended up persecuting people that weren't saints in the areas that they controlled. One of these things actually resulted in the death of Joseph Smith. There was a newspaper in Nauvoo that was not supportive of the Mormon government. It was known as the Nauvoo Expositor. And Smith ordered its presses destroyed. And because of that, Smith and his brother Hiram were arrested in the nearby town of Carthage, Illinois. He was assured that he would be protected from any sort of gang violence, mob violence, until he could be properly tried. But on June 27th, 1844, a mob broke into the prison. Hiram was shot in the face. Joseph Smith tried to escape through a window and was shot several times, resulting in his death. In the wake of Smith's death, the saints split into two groups. And some of the main differences had to do with who was to succeed Smith in leading the church, as well as some issues over plural marriage. The smaller group that developed out of this stayed in Missouri, stayed in the Midwest, stayed in the Midwest. And those congregations were reorganized a couple of years down the road in 1860. And they became known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They claimed that the years between Smith's death in 1860 were disorganized, but they were, this was meant to kind of bring together the saints again. So they reorganized in 1860, but it's the smaller group, the main group we'll talk about here in a minute. One of the main sticking points for members of the reorganized branch was plural marriage, polygamy. There were some points there were some people that claimed that Joseph Smith had not authorized the practice, that it had developed in other ways, and that there's some other differences as well about some distinctive doctrines, but this was a big one. The RLDS honored Smith's first wife, Emma Smith, who had remained silent about Joseph Smith's connection to plural marriage, but there seems to be good historical evidence that he had more than one wife. Another aspect of the reorganized branch was the importance of Joseph Smith's family. James J. Strang was the leader of the Reorganized Church for a while, but eventually Joseph III was selected as the leader of the group. He refused to believe that his father endorsed polygamy, but the family of Smith still became very important, and now church doctrine requires that the leader of the church be a descendant of Joseph Smith Jr. In 2001, the church changed its name to the Community of Christ. And so instead of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they claim it was for theological reasons. but certainly it functions as a way to distance the group from Mormons and Mormon fundamentalists. But the group still believes that Joseph Smith was a prophet from God. They still use the Book of Mormon. So, I mean, it's essentially a Mormon group, even though it is not the main stream group. The larger group of Latter-day Saints would eventually move westward, and leadership in that group was given to Brigham Young. Young had encountered the Book of Mormon shortly after its publication, and he became a Latter-day Saint in 1832. He was a very successful missionary. He rose through the church leadership. He is the one who publicized and admitted the church practiced plural marriage. And he had multiple marriages. He would also be the leader who took the Mormons to what is modern-day Utah in 1847. The area at the time was outside of United States control. It kind of belonged to Mexico. And so when the Mormons moved into this area, there, other than some Native Americans, there weren't any other groups around there. And so Smith and the Saints created what they called the state of Deseret. Deseret supposedly meant honeybee. In 1848, however, Mexico ceded this territory and some other lands south to the United States as a concession at the end of the war with Mexico. It became known as Utah Territory, and Young became the first governor of Utah Territory because there was already kind of, he'd already had some stability there, had set up a government. And so the United States said, all right, well, we'll just kind of allow that to stay. They would eventually remove him from that. He was considered to be kind of a dictator. And so he was removed from his position. But for a time, it was outside of United States territory. Right? They had gone to kind of escape persecution, and then all of a sudden it kind of brought them back. On the journey to Deseret, the U.S. government approached the Mormons about creating a battalion for the Army. The unit was formed in July of 1846 with the full support of church leadership. This has been the only religious unit specifically formed from a religious group in the United States Army. There have been some groups kind of associated with certain religions, like Irish units might have been associated with Catholicism. A lot of Irish in the early 19th century were Catholic, but it wasn't the Army recruiting specifically from Catholicism. In this case, it was the Army specifically recruiting from Mormonism to create this battalion. I guess the idea was, that it would further kind of try to keep the Mormons under control by the United States. The group basically did nothing. They marched to California, never engaged in battle, and after the war with Mexico, pretty well just disbanded. But it is kind of just an interesting little highlight of Mormon history, of U.S. history. The violence that marked early Mormonism did not end with the establishment of Utah, as I mentioned, because of Brigham Young's dictatorial practices. The government decided to remove him. And so in 1857, President James Buchanan sent a military force to Utah to remove Young as governor. And the information got to the Mormons. Well, in September of that year, 1857, a group of U.S. citizens who were traveling through to California is misidentified by Mormons as being this group that's coming to unseat Brigham Young. There are about 120 of them who were massacred on September 11th, 1857. It appears that about 50 to 60 Mormons, with maybe some Native American help, were responsible for their massacre. Now, Brigham Young supposedly had sent a letter on September 10th that basically told local Mormons not to meddle with the immigrants, to leave them alone. But that was overlooked. 17 of the children out of that 120 were spared. They were adopted by Mormon families, and later on down the line, they were eventually retrieved by their families, some by governmental officials. And so this event became known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre, or the Utah War. There wasn't much violence after the massacre. It was more, the presence of the military, but not actual firing or killing or anything after the events of September 11th. Certainly, there's a lot more we could say about Mormon history. We really don't have the time, of course, to talk about that. We're trying to get an overview. So I'd like to switch now to talking about some of the beliefs and practices of Mormonism, and again, highlighting some aspects of that. A very important belief within Mormonism is that prior to our physical existence, we had a spiritual existence. Sometimes this is referred to as the first estate, or premortal existence. It's believed that God the Father and a divine mother had spirit children, and the fall of humanity was not so much about a physical Adam and Eve engaging in sin, but these spirit children fell into sin. And so it's important that these spirit children have a mortal existence, right, to live on earth in order to kind of achieve their full potential. It's kind of physical life is kind of probation to divinity, right? And so the idea is that you can maybe achieve your full potential, overcome the effects of sin by having a physical existence, which is why it's been highly encouraged at various times for Mormons to have large families. And of course, there's been a lot of emphasis at various times from Mormons about the importance of families. But this gives those premortal spirits the opportunity to become human beings, which would in turn allow them to progress towards divinity potentially. Another key factor, especially in the context of talking about restoration of the church, was a belief in the restoration of the priesthood. Supposedly, Smith and a few others were given the priesthood to bring back ancient Christianity. And so the idea is that this notion of priesthood was a very important part of New Testament Christianity. Now, traditional church history, traditional Christianity, Orthodox church history, would question that notion of priesthood being a part of Christianity antiquity and not really something that's added. I mean, Christian history would say, this is something that comes out more in like the 3rd, 4th century, was not something that was a part of the earliest times of Christianity. But the claim from Smith and from the Mormons was this is a part of the earliest Christianity that had fallen out of use, and that even the priesthood of Catholicism or Anglicanism or something like that had not kept to the original priesthood. And so the idea is that Smith was now being given by John the Baptist, by John the Baptist, by the apostles, the responsibility of restoring the priesthood. And so men were now being called to this priesthood. There are two levels of the priesthood. The Aaronic priesthood, kind of connected with Aaron, Moses' brother, usually begins around the age of 12 for males, and then progresses depending on age. And so, you kind of, depending on your age, is what level you're in when it comes to the Aaronic priesthood. These priests, again, a lot of them very young, but they're the ones that, for example, pass what other Christians would call communion. For Mormons, it's bread and water instead of bread and wine or bread and grape juice. They also would be the ones to collect offerings. They may even teach or baptize. The second level of priesthood is known as the Melchizedek priesthood, after the Old Testament individual Melchizedek. This is a higher order within the church, and it's focused more on church government, like missionary work, being a bishop of a local ward, or a local congregation, we might say. So the priesthood is a very important part of the practice. Up until, well, one of the things that has been a challenge when it comes to the priesthood is that for a long period, African American males were excluded from the priesthood. There were beliefs among some Mormons that the Book of Mormon taught that the curse of Cain was connected to black skin. And so it wasn't until the 1970s, the late 1970s, that African American males were eligible to receive the priesthood. There is, however, some complexity to that. It seems like there's a possibility. There appears to be good evidence that there were African American priests in the earliest forms of Mormonism. And so the racist approach was something that gradually took place, as opposed to being something that was always in place. But like I said, for a long period of time, up through the 1970s, it was a practice to bar African American males from the priesthood. That's changed in the past 40 years. Another important part of Mormon practice is rituals involved in the temple. Now, there are buildings for worship throughout the country. These are places where Mormons gather weekly, and so you may in your hometown, or you may in a nearby city, see a building. We might call it a church building that says Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on the outside. That's different than the temple. The temples are much fewer in number. They're spread throughout the world. And so these are a different group. These buildings, like the one in Salt Lake City that's pictured here on the slide, have specific purposes. They are not just kind of a weekly gathering. I mean, it might be in some places there are weekly gatherings, but it's not the same type of place, sacred space, like a regular ward building would be. That's where there's a weekly gathering. The temples are about these special places. Usually for about 2 weeks after their construction, people are non-Mormons are allowed to visit, kind of take a tour through it, see what it's like, and then after that 2 weeks, it's closed to non-Mormons, and the only way to get into a temple after that point is to have a temple recommend. So you can't just go up to the temple and say, "Oh yeah, sure, I'm a Mormon, let me in." You have to have a recommendation from your local bishop that you pay your tithes, you're a Mormon in good standing, right? And so you have to have a temple recommend, and of course, that's a thing that's renewed fairly frequently, and so the bishop again will sit down with people, and make sure that they're still eligible to enter the temple. It's important to enter the temple for a couple of specific practices and rituals. One of those is baptism for the dead. Now, it's a church doctrine that in order to be saved, everyone must be baptized. But what about those who had not known about this? What about those who had never given the opportunity? So it's believed that living Mormons can receive baptism for someone else. And so this person who is dead can be baptized by proxy. Right? So you as a living Mormon could be baptized on behalf of someone else. Which is why there is such an interest in genealogies among Mormons, and why you even have genealogical sites that are run by the church or other individuals connected with the church, because they want to make sure everybody has the opportunity to be baptized. And so, the living persons, kind of, I'm being baptized for, this person. Now, it's important to note that proxy baptism itself doesn't automatically save the person you're being baptized for. It's kind of like in the afterlife, that person is kind of, told, well, not told, but that person finds out that you've been baptized for them, and then they have the opportunity whether to accept it or reject it. The practice at various times has caused some controversy. The official position of the church is that you are only to be baptized for people in your family line, although the people will be baptized on behalf of famous people. But one of the concerns was that it became known a couple decades ago that there were some people being baptized for Jews that had died in the Holocaust, which, for living Jews, they felt like that kind of demeans the memory of those that died in the Holocaust. People that died in the Holocaust died because they were Jews. And that baptism for the dead seems like it's trying to make them Mormon, which may or may not have been what the Mormons that were doing this were trying to do, but it was very offensive. And so there was a pressure from the Jewish community to remove those names from the records. Supposedly they were locked in a database, but there have been other times, even in more recent history, where it's come out that there's been some situation like this. And so it's kind of renewed the controversy every so often about especially Jews that have died in the Holocaust. Another ritual that can only be performed in the temple is a celestial marriage. Such a marriage is essentially an eternal sealing of a marriage between a man and a woman. That you're going to be married for eternity, and then in the afterlife you're still going to be married. It's necessary for exaltation in the afterlife. When, as far as my understanding is, when plural marriages were practiced, polygamous marriages were practiced, a man would only be sealed in a temple ceremony, a celestial marriage, to one woman. So one eternal marriage, and then the others wouldn't necessarily be eternal. But the language that's used is sealing, and it does appear like there were some people, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, there were some people that were sealed to Joseph Smith after his death. So it's a little confusing to me. You can get a divorce from a celestial marriage, but it is a very, very difficult process in the church. Another important doctrine, a distinctive doctrine, I should say, that marks Mormonism different from other forms of religion in the United States, particularly Christianity, is what's known as the degrees of glory. The degrees of glory refers to a understanding of the Mormon afterlife and what the Mormon afterlife is like. They're essentially kind of different realms or different levels where people will end up in the afterlife based on who they were, what they. So there is outer darkness or perdition. These are, I mean, it's not hell like would be in traditional Christianity. And essentially the only people that are going to end up here would be those that kind of joined the church, later rejected it, apostatized, and then actively worked against the church. So it's not as if all wicked people would end up here. It would also include Satan and his helpers, right? So there's other people there beyond just Mormon apostates, but it's not where, it's not going to be. It's not like all the good are in the other parts and all the wicked are in outer darkness, right? These are the worst of the wicked would be in outer darkness. Outside of outer darkness, there's 3 levels of kingdoms. The lowest level of kingdoms is the Telestial Kingdom. These are people who would have rejected the gospel, which, of course, the gospel means Mormon form of the gospel, Mormon teaching, which would include the Book of Mormon. Those that rejected the gospel, those that rejected Jesus, as well as sinful people like liars and adulterers. Right? So it's not hell, but it is the lowest of the afterlife kingdoms. Above it is the terrestrial kingdom. These are people, non-Mormons, who lived good lives and accepted baptism. So this is where they would be. Then there is the celestial kingdom. This is, of course, where faithful Mormons would be, those that accepted baptism, those that fulfilled the priesthood. It also has several levels to it. The highest of the levels is known as the Church of the Firstborn. And in this level, it's possible to be exalted to divinity. This would have been a person, predominantly a male, who was a good Mormon, had lived in the priesthood, followed the rituals. And the idea has often been expressed, right, that you have the opportunity here to become a god and populate your own planet. Well, that's kind of, I mean, there's this popular level form of that. But essentially the idea is that God became God by following the gospel principles of Mormonism. And so the opportunity exists for human beings, again, predominantly males, to achieve similar types of things. As as I was looking for graphics to put on this slide, one that I came across that I really just like that I want to share with you is this one, copyrighted in 1950, and you can tell, right, it's a 1950, a 1950s type of picture, but meant to demonstrate. There's the Telestial Kingdom. I do like this detour 1,000 years in hell, right, which is that outer darkness. But then, of course, the Broadway to the Telestial Kingdom, or the Terrestrial Kingdom, I should say, and then how to get to the Celestial Kingdom with the 3 levels, and the different aspects here of how to live. The word of wisdom refers to a revelation that came to Joseph Smith about how people are supposed to live. It includes things like, not drinking coffee or tea or other stimulants related to that. One thing that a lot of people know about in connection with Mormonism is the idea of plural marriage or polygamy. But before I talk about the practice, I do want to highlight a couple of things. Most Mormon men, when polygamy was routinely practiced, most Mormon men were monogamous. And probably no more than 10 to 15,000 Mormons lived in polygamous marriages. So it was less of a common occurrence than what we sometimes think it was. But it became very much a hallmark of Mormon identity because it became the point where a lot of people opposed them. Now, it's also important to note that those who gained the highest positions in Mormonism, especially in the priesthood, almost always married more than one wife. And so there was this expectation that if you're higher in the church, you needed to have more wives. And, you know, some of that is doctrine, some of that's peer pressure. But most polygamous men had 2 or 3 wives at most. Right? There's not this, you know, rampant multitude. Although people in the higher levels had higher numbers of wives. Brigham Young is said to have had 55 wives. Again, not all of those wives were necessarily sexual partners. And some of those wives might be sealed to leaders of the church and still be married to other men. That did happen a couple times with Brigham Young. When it comes to Joseph Smith, the exact number of wives that Joseph had is unclear. You know, some said, well, I mean, obviously the Reformed said, you know, none, and then some others have it pretty high, but most scholars of Mormonism put it around 33. But as I mentioned just a little bit ago, one of the situations we have is that there are indications of some wives being sealed to Joseph Smith after his death. Right, so you know it's you know it's like, okay, how's that work in this counting? But it's a really kind of hazy thing when it comes to Joseph Smith compared to some other people. Plural marriage was supposedly revealed to God, or revealed from God to Joseph Smith in 1831, and made a doctrine in 1843. It's really interesting aspect to it, and the one of the readings that you're doing for a reflection essay, if I remember correctly, you're reading from Doctrine and Covenants. I think it's the plural marriage one. If it's not, you can certainly look up Doctrine and Covenants. The Mormons have it on their website where you can read it. It's really an interesting document, this particular revelation, because it's kind of like God telling Joseph Smith to tell Emma, his first wife, that she basically has to just deal with the fact that there's going to be multiple wives. Really, it's a really kind of interesting depiction of Joseph Smith receiving this revelation. So it was something that was being practiced, but it's not until 1852 when Brigham Young officially indicates, yes, this is being practiced. So a lot of it was being practiced. Some of it was done in secrecy. A lot of people knew it was taking place, but the church never officially said, yes, we're doing this until 1852. And it's then when Brigham Young officially says, yes, this is being practiced. Now, we might ask, okay, why would somebody be in a plural marriage? Why would a woman be in a plural marriage? It wasn't necessarily a overabundance of women, more women than men, and so, because of the 19th century, and so you need to marry these women to somebody. That's not the case. Early Mormonism was about equal between men and women, about the same number. So it wasn't overabundance of women. Certainly, it's a religious doctrine. It's sanctioned by the church. It provided the opportunities for poor women, maybe some unattractive women, to be married to successful, wealthy men. There was certainly pressure from their families to marry well-placed men, no matter how much older they were. Motherhood, of course, very, very highly respected at the time. And so this would be an opportunity for women to be mothers. So, there were a variety of reasons that I think could point to why somebody would be willing to go into this marriage, even though it's, you have a multitude of wives. The U.S. government several times tried to stop the practice. In 1862, Congress passed a law making it illegal. Brigham Young was arrested under that law, but it was later dropped for evidence. In 1874, another law was passed, meant to be, even stronger. In 1882, another was passed to try to make that even stronger. There were raids by federal marshals in Utah Territory. There was a creation, and so the Mormons, in response, kind of created an underground to help people that were polygamists, flee to Mexico, to Canada. In 1887, there was another, right? So there's several attempts here, but it's not stopping the practice. It didn't stop the practice. But in 1890, almost 67 years to the day that Joseph was first told about the plates, the president of the Latter-day Saints, a man named Willard Woodruff, released a document known as the Manifesto. And in the Manifesto, he claimed that he had received a revelation from God that the church no longer sanctioned polygamy. That at one time they had practiced it, it had been a church doctrine, but now it was no longer to be practiced by saints. In 1893, the President of the United States offered amnesty for all people who were polygamists prior to 1890. And in 1896, Utah finally became a state, even though it had met other conditions for statehood much earlier than this. So it seems like plural marriage, the practice of plural marriage by Mormons in Utah Territory, had kept Utah from becoming a state until it was rejected. Polygamy, of course, is still practiced by some groups, predominantly fundamentalist groups. The mainstream church denounces polygamy, recognizes, yes, it was practiced, but God had only revealed it for a certain time, and that anyone that is practicing it now is going to be excommunicated, kicked out of the church. But as I mentioned, there is this splinter group today known as Mormon fundamentalism. And it kind of develops when Latter-day Saints in the early 20th century began to realize that there were new polygamous unions in their midst, right? Things that had happened since 1890. And so, there was a church battle that split off into what became known as fundamentalist saints. There are about 20 to 30,000 Mormon fundamentalists today. About 3/4, and it's probably actually higher at this point, were never members of a mainstream Latter-day Saint church. It doesn't seem like a majority of fundamentalists started off in the mainstream church and then decided to become a fundamentalist. The people that are connected here, a lot of them are family, right? Children, descendants of fundamentalists, and a few converts. But in many respects, fundamentalism not all fundamentalists are polygamists. It's the one place where polygamy is practiced, but not everyone is polygamist. Many of those that broke off believed that with the Manifesto, the church was capitulating to American culture. Right? Prior to 1890, leaders of the church said, right, it's vital to our identity, it's a non-negotiable, and then suddenly that's not true anymore. And so the fundamentalist movement really becomes dissatisfied with that and splits off, finally formalizes a split in the 1930s. It's specifically as a self-identified fundamentalist group. Essentially, the conviction is that the mainstream church had strayed, that plural marriage had been a revelation, and a revelation that that was meant for all time, not just for a specific period, like Woodruff and other leaders claimed. And the other thing that's important here, of course, is thinking about the priesthood authority, right? Because it's cut off from the mainstream Mormon church. So where the priesthood being an important part of Mormonism, how does that fit in here? It actually developed outside of the priesthood among fundamentalists, developed outside of the sanction of the mainstream church, and so most fundamentalists connect to a man named Loren Woodley, who became an ex-member of the mainstream church, but had been appointed a priest by the president of the church, John Taylor, in 1886. What would be the appeal of staying in fundamentalism? Well, it's a belief that that the mainstream church had abandoned the doctrines of the Latter-day Saints, not just polygamy. And so they believe that those older doctrines are better. Remember some of the things we talked about with fundamentalist movements in general. Of course, fundamentalists very intense on doctrinal and emphasizing the doctrinal, the doctrines. And there's also kind of a perceived lack of spirituality among the mainstream church, even though nearly all fundamentalists believe that the Latter-day Saints was the divinely appointed true church. They just believe that it had gone astray and had abandoned what was originally intended when God restored it through Joseph Smith. The last area that I want to talk a little bit about related to the Latter-day Saints is politics. And within this, you see some things related to how Mormons have kind of sometimes not fit in, sometimes other times fit in with American culture, and how Mormonism is a lot more acceptable today than it was when it first began. There is still a lot of opposition to Mormonism, still a lot of marginalization that Mormons face. And of course, a lot of people, especially in the United States, don't want the Mormons coming by. They don't want to talk to the Mormons, right? And so there's still this kind of stigma attached to Mormonism. But Mormons are a lot more mainstream now than they were. And I think some of this is reflected in what we can see with the politics, a couple of instances of politics. In 1843, Joseph Smith, still alive then, 1843, sends a letter to the 5 main contenders in the presidency. So these 5 people vying for the nomination in the presidency, and basically saying, what do you plan to do about the persecutions Mormons face? Only 3 of those 5 responded, and the response was not particularly favorable to Mormons. And nobody seems to really have supported, right, or promoted an idea of I'm going to try and help Mormons out. So in 1844, Smith declares that he's going to run for president of the United States, and that he's going to, kind of create this blending of religious rule and democracy, what he calls a theodemocracy. It's never really clear what that was or what it would have looked like, because he dies in June of that year. So it never really, there's not a lot of things that get done with that, but it was an attempt, albeit a small one, to try and influence the politics of the United States. Another major development in this would have been the election of Reed Smoot as a senator from Utah. He was elected in 1902, but when he came to Washington to become a senator, to be seated, there were hearings about whether or not he could serve, since he was a Mormon apostle, high figure in the church. He was 3rd in line for presidency of the church when he died. There were also hearings related to whether or not polygamy was still being practiced. There was, a lot of questions. His career was not particularly auspicious. He was one of the sponsors of a tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, that some people claim brought about the Great Depression. So not a necessarily auspicious career. More recently, within the last decade, and then also just recently, Mitt Romney is running for Senate in Utah. He's the Republican nominee for Senate in Utah. He was governor of Massachusetts for a while. He ran for presidency in 2008 as a Republican. One of the challenges he did face, especially from evangelical Christians, was whether or not, what talk about your religion, right? How's your religion going to influence? And so there were a lot of conservative evangelicals that were hesitant to endorse Romney because of his religious commitments, despite him being very conservative politically. And so he runs for the nomination in 2008. He runs for the presidency, is the nominee in 2012. So by 2012, there's less opposition to him, but there wasn't enough support to, for him to be elected. So it does kind of indicate that there was kind of more of an openness to a Mormon candidate, predominantly because of such opposition to President Obama, especially. So this gives us, there's so much more we could say about Mormonism, but I think this highlights, here's this new religious movement that developed in the United States, managed to continue like Jehovah's Witnesses after the death of the founder, and that today is still in some ways on the outside, in other ways mainstreamed, but a really interesting group for us to look at. Next week, after this kind of finishes up this third section, it's this material from this point until from the end of the second test to this point is what's going to be on the next exam. But from this point on, we're going to be looking at other kind of more, well, we'll talk about atheism, but then we'll also get into some more topics rather than specific religious institutions, and we'll pick that up with our next session.